But in the winter of 1862, blood is just another thing that freezes in the mud. Two brothers, raised under the same roof in Kentucky, now stand on opposite sides of a line drawn in lead. One fights for a flag he believes is sacred. The other fights to break the shackles he was born to protect. When the smoke clears on the battlefield of Shiloh, only one truth remains. A house divided doesn't just fall, it buries everyone inside. The Threshold of Judas. The dinner table at the Galloway estate was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the bluegrass hills of Kentucky were cloaked in a deceptive peace, but inside, the air was sharp with the scent of a dying era. Thomas Galloway sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on his two sons. To his left sat Julian, dressed in a crisp gray wool coat, the uniform of a Confederate officer. To his right sat Caleb, his youngest, whose travel bag sat by the door, stuffed with a Union blue jacket he hadn't yet dared to put on. "You're a fool, Caleb," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You'd turn your back on your own blood for a government that doesn't know your name? They want to burn our way of life to the ground." "It's not a way of life, Julian. It's a cage. We've built a kingdom on the backs of men who have names, souls, and families. I won't spend my life guarding a graveyard." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, rattling the china. "Enough! This house stays neutral. We are Kentuckians. We do not choose." "The choice has already been made, Father." Caleb stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood. "The state legislature has declared for the Union. The rebels are marching on the border. If I stay here, I'm a ghost. If I leave, I'm a man." Julian stood as well, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his saber. The brothers, who had once spent their summers swimming in the creek and sharing secrets in the hayloft, now looked at each other like strangers across a canyon. "If I see you on the field, Caleb," Julian whispered, his face pale with a mix of fury and grief, "I won't see a brother, I'll see a target." Caleb grabbed his bag and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, the cold night air rushing in to meet him. "Then make sure your aim is true, Julian, because I won't be looking for you. I'll be looking for the men who kept those chains tight." As the Caleb disappeared into the darkness, a distant roll of thunder shook the house. But it wasn't a storm. It was the sound of Union wagons moving south. The divide was no longer a debate. It was a war. The transition from the warmth of the Galloway dining room to the frozen hell of the Tennessee woods had taken only 3 months, but to Caleb it felt like a lifetime. The year was now 1862. The air was no longer filled with the scent of bluegrass Kentucky. It was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sulphurous stench of spent gunpowder. Caleb's hands were cracked and bleeding, his nail cakes cucked with the frozen mud of a trench he had spent 6 hours digging. Around him, the 24th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, a patchwork unit of farmers, blacksmiths, and runaway clerks, huddled over small, smokeless fires. They were the Union's shield, but they looked more like ghosts waiting for a haunting. "Keep your head down, Galloway," a voice rasped. It was Sergeant Miller, a man whose face looked like a map of bad decisions. "The Rebs have sharpshooters in the tree line. They're looking for brass buttons. Don't give 'em a reason to find yours." Caleb nodded, pulling his thin wool coat tighter. His mind drifted back to the dinner table, to Julian. Was his brother out there in the dark? Was Julian sitting behind a long-range Whitworth rifle, waiting for a head to pop above the dirt? The thought was a cold stone in his stomach. Suddenly, a low moan drifted through the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound Caleb had heard every night since they arrived at the outskirts of the Red River. It was the sound of the chain gangs. Behind the Confederate lines, the rebel army was forcing enslaved men to build fortifications in the middle of the night. You could hear the rhythmic clink-clank of the iron shackles hitting the frozen earth. It was a sickening irony. The Union soldiers were freezing to protect a concept of freedom, while the very people they intended to free were being worked to death to stop them. "We're moving at dawn," Miller whispered, crawling closer. "The general wants that bridge. If we take the bridge, we cut off the supply line to the Red Oak plantation. That's Yurlian's sector, isn't it?" Caleb stiffened. "It is. You still got the stomach for this, kid? If you see that gray coat with the Galloway crest, can you pull the trigger?" Caleb looked at his rifle. The wood was cold. The steel was indifferent. "He told me I was a target, Sergeant. He made his choice." But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the snow a sickly orange, the silence was shattered. A rebel yell, a high-pitched, terrifying scream that sounded like 1,000 dying banshees, tore through the morning mist. "They're charging!" Sergeant Miller screamed. The tree line exploded in a flash of musketry. Caleb lunged for his rifle, his boot slipping on the icy rim of the trench. Through the smoke, he saw them, a wave of gray ghosts sprinting across the open field. At the front of the charge, mounted on a black horse that looked like it had been carved from shadow, was an officer. The officer didn't carry a rifle. He carried a saber that caught the morning light like a lightning bolt. Even through the haze of black powder, Caleb recognized the posture, the arrogance, the way he held his head. It was Julian. He wasn't just leading a charge, he was leading it straight towards Caleb's position. Julian's eyes were locked forward, his face a mask of zealotry. To him, this wasn't a brother he was charging, it was an obstacle to his glory. Caleb leveled his Springfield rifle. His breath hitched. The front sight settled on Julian's chest. The world went silent. The clink of the slave chains in the distance seemed to grow louder, a reminder of why he was there. "Forgive me," Caleb whispered. He pulled the trigger. The kickback bruised his shoulder, but he didn't blink. He watched the mini-balls streak through the air, but at the last second, Julian's horse stumbled on a hidden root in the mud. The bullet missed Julian's heart, tearing instead through the shoulder of his gray tunic. Julian tumbled from his horse, disappearing into a sea of charging infantry and exploding dirt. "Reload!" Miller shouted, shoving Caleb back into reality. "They're on the wire. Reload or die." The chains of the past were broken, but the chains of the war had just tightened. Caleb grabbed a cartridge, bit the paper off with his teeth, and tasted the bitter salt of gunpowder. The boy from Kentucky was gone. Only the soldier remained. Mud-slicked surge. Caleb ran blindly, his bayonet fixed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He didn't find Julian. The spot where the horse had fallen was a crater of churned earth and broken timber, but the body in the gray tunic was gone. "Push forward!" Sergeant Miller bellowed, his face blackened by soot. "Take the ridge! Don't give him a second to breathe!" By dusk, the Union had pushed the Confederate line back 2 miles, capturing a makeshift camp tucked into a ravine. The Red Oak sector had fallen. While the rest of the company scavenged for hardtack and dry blankets, Caleb wandered toward the back of the camp, drawn by a sound he couldn't ignore, the rhythmic, hollow, metallic rattling he had heard from the trenches. He rounded a supply wagon and stopped dead. A group of 20 men, their skin the color of deep mahogany and their clothes little more than rags, sat huddled together. They weren't free. They were chained to a long iron bar bolted into the frozen ground. These were the men who had been forced to dig the very trenches Julian had used to launch his attack. Caleb approached, his rifle lowered. The men didn't look up. They had the hollow, 1,000-yard stare of people who had seen the end of the world and survived it. I have a key," Caleb stammered, reaching into a pouch he'd looted from a fallen Confederate sergeant. One man, older than the rest, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with gratitude. They were filled with a weary, sharp intelligence. "You got the key for the iron, boy, but do you have the key for what comes after? You think because you wear blue, the world's gonna turn kind tomorrow? Caleb knelt and began working the lock on the man's ankle cuff. I'm here to finish what I started. My family, my brother, he fought to keep you here. I fought to get here. The lock clicked open. The man rubbed his raw, bloody skin. Your brother, the one on the black horse? Caleb froze. You saw him? He didn't die, the man whispered, leaning in close. He was dragged off by his scouts, but before they took him, he dropped something he didn't want the Yanks to find. The man reached into the folds of his tattered shirt and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It was soaked in water and blood, but the crest on the cover was unmistakable, the Galloway family seal. Caleb opened it, his hands shaking. He expected to find troop movements or supply lists. Instead, he found a map of the Galloway estate, but with markings he didn't recognize. There were lines drawn from the basement of their family home, leading deep into the Appalachian woods, labeled with the names of assets. As Caleb scanned the names, his breath hitched. They weren't just names of slaves. They were names of high-ranking Union officials, followed by dates and dollar amounts. He wasn't just a soldier, Caleb realized, the horror dawning on him. Julian was running a spy ring. He's been using the plantation as a hub for the Confederate Secret Service. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The war wasn't just out here on the battlefields. It was inside his own home. Every letter he had sent his father, every detail about his regiment's movement, Julian had likely seen it all. He's heading back there, the old man said, standing up on shaky legs, to burn the evidence. And if he burns that house, he burns everyone still in it, including the ones who can't run. Caleb looked toward the north, toward the home he thought he had left behind. The sky was darkening, and a cold rain began to fall. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a hunter. "Sergeant!" Caleb yelled, turning back toward the camp. "I need a horse, and I need it now!" The chains were off the prisoners, but the invisible chains of Julian's betrayal were now pulling Caleb back into the heart of the fire. The Galloway estate appeared through the mist like a decaying skeleton. There were no lights in the windows. The grand white pillars, once a symbol of pride, now looked like the bars of a bleached cage. As Caleb dismounted, the silence was absolute. No crickets, no wind, just the distant rhythmic thud of an axe. Caleb drew his Colt Army revolver. He didn't go to the front door. He knew the house's secrets better than any invading army. He slipped through the cellar bulkhead, his boots crunching on spilled coal. The air down here was stagnant, smelling of damp earth and something else, kerosene. He followed the sound of the axe to the library. Through the cracked door, Caleb saw him. Julian was there, his gray tunic stiff with dried blood, his left arm tied in a crude sling. With his one good hand, he was swinging a small hatchet, smashing the floorboards beneath their father's mahogany desk. "Looking for the trap door, Julian?" Caleb's voice was steady, though his heart was screaming. Julian froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. "You were always the sentimental one, Caleb. I figured you'd be halfway to Nashville, chasing some glorious Union dream." "I found the ledger," Caleb said, stepping into the room. "I know about the spies. I know you sold out the 24th Kentucky before we even crossed the border. How many of my friends died for your way of life?" "I didn't sell them out for money, you fool. I did it for survival. This nation is a corpse, and the maggots in Washington are picking it clean. I was building a future where our name still meant something." "Our name is covered in blood," Caleb roared, leveling the pistol at Julian's chest. "Is it?" Julian smiled, a terrifying, jagged expression. He kicked away a loose floorboard, revealing a dark cavity filled with iron crates. Father knew Caleb. He didn't stay neutral. He funded the whole operation. He's in the study right now, waiting for the cleaners to arrive. They're not rebels and they're not Yanks. They're mercenaries. Their job is to make sure this house and everyone who knows its secrets disappears tonight. Caleb's blood ran cold. Where is he? In his chair, where he always is, Julian said, his hand sliding toward a lantern resting on the desk. But you're too late. The fuses are already set in the basement. This house was built on a chain of chains, Caleb. It's only fitting it goes down in smoke. Julian's hand gripped the lantern. Drop it, Caleb commanded. You won't shoot, Julian challenged, stepping closer, the lantern swaying dangerously. You still see the boy who taught you to ride. You still see the brother who pulled you out of the creek. You're weak, Caleb. You fight for a union that hates you, while I fight for the only thing that's real, blood. Suddenly, the floorboards groaned. A heavy footstep echoed from the hallway, but it wasn't their father. The door swung open, and the man with the scar from the camp, the one Caleb had freed, stood there. He wasn't in rags anymore. He wore a stolen Confederate coat and carried a heavy Henry repeating rifle. Behind him were 3 other freedmen, their eyes cold and focused. The cleaners won't be coming, Captain, the scarred man said, looking at Julian. We met them at the gate. They didn't have much to say. Julian's face went pale. The power dynamic had shifted in a heartbeat. The men he had chained were now standing in his father's library, holding the keys to his life. Caleb, Julian whispered, his voice finally cracking. Don't let them do this. This is our home. Caleb looked at his brother, then at the scarred man, then at the house that had been built on the labor of the broken. He realized then that the nation divided wasn't just a map, it was this room. It's not a home, Caleb, he said, his voice cold as the Kentucky winter. It's a crime scene. Caleb lowered his gun, but he didn't move to stop the men as they stepped forward. His heels hitting the edge of the iron crates. The lantern in his hand flickered, casting long, monstrous shadows against the rows of leather-bound books. "Caleb, tell them," Julian pleaded, his voice reaching a frantic pitch. "Tell them what happens if they kill a Confederate officer. They'll hunt you all down. They'll string you up from the oaks in the front yard." The scarred man, whose name Caleb now knew was Moses, didn't flinch. He leveled his rifle at Julian's throat. "The hunting started a long time ago, Captain. We're just finishing the trail." Caleb stepped between them, but he didn't point his gun at Moses. He kept it aimed at the floor. "Wait," Caleb said. "You're protecting him?" Moses asked, his eyes narrowing. "After what you saw in that camp? After the ledger?" "I'm not protecting him," Caleb replied, his voice hollow. "I'm protecting the truth. If he dies here, the names in that book die with him. The spies in the Union, the men who are sending our soldiers to their graves, they'll stay in the shadows. We need him alive to talk." Julian saw a flicker of hope and sneered. "He's right. I'm the only one who knows the ciphers. You kill me, and you're just killing a soldier. You keep me alive, and I'm a bargaining chip." But Julian's arrogance was his final mistake. As he spoke, his hand tightened on the lantern, and he tried to lunge toward the open trap door, intending to drop the flame into the kerosene-soaked basement and vanish into the tunnels. "No!" Caleb lunged. Moses fired. The heavy thud of the Henry rifle echoed through the house. The bullet didn't hit Julian. It shattered the glass of the lantern in his hand. Liquid fire exploded. In an instant, the kerosene on the floor ignited. A wall of blue and orange flame roared upward, separating Caleb from his brother. Julian screamed as the fire caught his wool sleeve, scrambling backward into the basement opening. "Julian!" Caleb screamed, reaching through the heat. The house groaned. Below them, the old timber, dry as bone and soaked in fuel, turned into a furnace. The basement was a death trap. Through the smoke, Caleb saw Julian's face one last time. Not the face of a soldier or a spy, but the terrified boy who used to hide in the cellar during summer storms. "Caleb, get out!" Julian's voice was barely a whisper over the roar of the fire. "It's all going down! Get out!" The floor beneath the heavy mahogany desk buckled. With a deafening crack, the center of the library collapsed into the inferno below. Julian was gone, swallowed by the very darkness he had helped create. "Move, now!" Moses grabbed Caleb by the collar of his Union coat and hauled him toward the hallway. They sprinted through the house as the curtains turned into sheets of fire. Caleb burst through the front doors, collapsing onto the wet grass of the lawn. He turned back just in time to see the roof of the Galloway Manor cave in, sending a pillar of sparks screaming into the black Kentucky sky. As the rain hissed against the glowing embers, Caleb sat in the mud, clutching the ledger to his chest. Moses stood over him, his face illuminated by the dying fire of the plantation. "The chains are broken, soldier, but the fire is just beginning." Caleb looked at the ruins. His brother was gone. His father was nowhere to be found. His home was ash. He was a man without a past, standing in the middle of a nation that was tearing itself apart to find a future. He stood up, wiped the soot from his face, and looked toward the north. The war was far from over, but for the first time in Caleb's life, Caleb wasn't following a ghost. He was walking toward the light of a new, albeit sparred, world. The morning after the fire was gray and hollow. Caleb stood on the blackened earth of the plantation, his Union uniform singed and smelling of kerosene. Moses and his men had vanished into the woods before dawn, heading for the Union lines in Ohio. They were free, but Caleb was now a man haunted by two different ghosts, the brother he couldn't save and the father who had betrayed him. He opened the blood-stained ledger. Most of the names were written in a jagged numeric code, but one address was clear: 114 Bank Street, Washington, D.C. "The Spider's Nest," Caleb whispered. 2 weeks later, Caleb found himself in the heart of the Union capital. Washington was a city of mud and marble, overflowing with wounded soldiers, frantic politicians, and shadows. He'd traded his mud-caked infantry boots for the polished leather of a military courier. It was the only way to move through the city's high society circles without drawing suspicion. He stood outside a grand brick townhouse on Bank Street. This was the home of Senator Silas Sterling, a man known for his fiery speeches in defense of the Union. According to the ledger, Sterling wasn't a patriot. He was the primary financer for Julian's spy ring. He bypassed the front door, slipping through a servant's entrance. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and old paper. He moved like a phantom through the hallways until he reached the senator's private study. The room was a shrine to power. Map cases lined the walls, detailing Union troop movements in Virginia. Caleb's heart hammered as he saw a map of the Rappahannock River. His own former regiment's position was circled in red ink. Next to it was a note in Julian's handwriting: "The trap is set. Let the harvest begin." "You're late for the meeting, Corporal." Caleb spun around, his hand flying to the holster at his hip. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked nothing like a senator. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate black suit, with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sea. It was Silas Sterling himself. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two men in civilian clothes, their hands tucked ominously into their heavy coats. "You're not a corporal," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, "and I'm not here for a meeting." Sterling walked to his desk, completely unfazed by Caleb's weapon. He poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "I know who you are, Caleb Galloway. Julian spoke of you often. He said you were the only true believer left in your family. A tragic flaw." "He's dead," Caleb snapped. "The house is gone. The ledger is in my hands." Sterling paused, the glass halfway to his lips. A small, cruel smile touched his face. "The ledger, you mean? That little book of numbers? Do you really think Julian was the architect? He was a delivery boy, Caleb. A brave one, but a delivery boy nonetheless." Sterling leaned over the desk, his shadow stretching across the maps. "The chains that hold this country together aren't made of iron anymore. They're made of debt, secrets, and blood. You think you're here to stop a spy. You're standing in the middle of a machine that has been running since 1776, and you, boy, are a very small gear." "I'll take this to the president," Caleb threatened. "The president is a busy man, and my men are very fast." One of the guards stepped forward, drawing a snub-nosed revolver, but before he could level it, a window behind the senator shattered. A heavy glass bottle, wrapped in a burning rag, thudded onto the expensive Persian rug. "Fire!" Sterling shouted, stumbling back. Through the broken window, Caleb saw a silhouette on the roof of the carriage house across the alley. It was Sarah, the courier Silas Thorne had trusted back in Charleston. She signaled to Caleb with a sharp whistle. "The machine is breaking, Senator," Caleb yelled over the roar of the sudden fire. He didn't shoot. Instead, he grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and smashed the senator's locked dresser drawer, grabbing a stack of correspondence that Julian's ledger had only hinted at. As the guard scrambled to put out the fire, Caleb dived through the shattered window, landing hard on the cobblestones of the alleyway. Sarah was already there, holding the reins of 2 horses. "The ledger was just the beginning," she said, her eyes flashing in the dark. "They're moving the gold tonight. If that shipment reaches the South, the war will never end." Caleb swung into the saddle. He had come to Washington to find a spy, but he had found a conspiracy that reached the very ceiling of the Union. The hunt wasn't over. It had just gone global. Length of hemp rope, the freezing rain lashing his face until his skin was numb. Every time the wanderer plunged into a trough, he thought the ship would never rise again. "The pumps can't keep up," Sarah screamed over the roar of the gale. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, working alongside the freedmen to bail out the lower decks. "We hold the course," Caleb roared back. Through the sheet of torrential rain, a flash of lightning illuminated the horizon. For a split second, the world turned electric blue, revealing a terrifying sight. Ahead, at the mouth of the Mississippi, sat the Ouroboros. The syndicate's flagship was a behemoth of iron and steam, nearly 300 feet long. Unlike the Viper, this ship was built to withstand a god's wrath. It sat low and heavy in the water, its twin smokestacks belching thick, greasy soot that refused to be washed away by the storm. "She's already at the pass," the captain yelled from the helm. "If she enters the river, the fort's cannons won't be able to pierce that armor. She'll steam straight to New Orleans and level the city." Caleb looked at the Ouroboros, then at the crates of phosphorus fire they had left. The storm had made the deck too slick for a boarding party, and their cannons were useless against that iron hide. He realized there was only one way to stop a Leviathan. You had to choke it from the inside. "Captain, aim us for her stern," Caleb shouted. "You're going to ram her in this sea? We'll sink in seconds." "We're not ramming her to sink her," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the massive, exposed rudder and the churning bronze propellers of the ironclad. "We're going to foul her engines." The Wanderer tilted at a 45-degree angle as it rode a massive swell. Caleb untied himself, sliding across the deck toward Sarah. "I need the anchor chain and every bit of heavy rope we have. We're going to weave a web." In a desperate, coordinated effort, the crew lashed their spare anchor to a massive tangle of thick, tarred ropes and iron chains. They rigged it to the stern of the Wanderer. As the Wanderer crested the next wave, the captain steered them into a suicidal dive, crossing directly behind the path of the Ouroboros. "Drop it!" The anchor and its web of chains plunged into the wake of the ironclad. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Wanderer lurched violently, nearly snapping its own mast. Below the surface, the Ouroboros's massive propellers, designed for power, not for clearing debris, sucked in the anchor and the heavy ropes. The iron chains wrapped around the drive shaft with the sound of 1,000 screaming saws. The ironclad shuddered. A massive explosion of steam erupted from its vents as the engines ground to a catastrophic halt. The Leviathan was paralyzed. "Now, while they're dead in the water!" Caleb yelled. But the Ouroboros wasn't defenseless. Even without its engines, its turret guns began to rotate. A massive 10-inch gun leveled itself at the Wanderer. "Brace!" The world turned into fire. The shell hit the Wanderer's bow, shattering the wood into 1,000,000 splinters. Caleb was thrown through the air, hitting the deck hard. His vision blurred. Through the ringing in his ears, he saw the ironclad side doors open. Small boats filled with syndicate mercenaries, the Gold Blacks, began to lower into the water. They weren't waiting to be sunk. They were coming to finish the Wanderer by hand. Caleb crawled toward his saber, his hand shaking. He looked up to see Sarah standing over him, her rifle leveled at the first boat. "The storm is breaking, Caleb," she whispered, her voice steady. She was right. The wind was dying down, but the real storm, the one made of lead and steel, was just reaching the deck. From the mist, the mercenaries began to climb the netting, their eyes cold and their intentions clear. Caleb stood up, leaning on the mast for support. He pulled Julian's ledger from his pocket and threw it to Sarah. "If I don't make it off this deck, get that to the authorities in New Orleans. Every name. Don't let the fire go out." "Caleb, no! Go!" Caleb drew his saber and his pistol, facing the first wave of men boarding the ship. Behind him, the paralyzed Ouroboros loomed like a dying god, and ahead, the lights of a divided nation waited to see who would survive the night. The first mercenary over the rail was a man with a jagged scar across his throat, wearing the black and gold armband of the syndicate. He didn't speak. He simply leveled a short-barreled shotgun. Caleb swung his saber in a desperate arc, catching the man's wrist as the blast went wide, peppering the mast with lead. With a grunt of focused rage, he threw his shoulder into the man, sending him back into the dark water. But for every one that fell, 3 took their place. The deck of the Wanderer became a slaughterhouse. Caleb fought with the fluidity of a man who had nothing left to lose. He parried a bayonet thrust, spun, and fired his Colt into the chest of a boarder. Beside him, the remaining crew, freedmen and sailors alike, fought with the ferocity of the damned. They weren't just fighting for a ship, they were fighting for the literal heart of the continent. "Caleb, behind you!" Sarah's voice pierced the din. He turned just in time to see a massive figure stepping onto the deck from a boarding plank. It was the Syndicate's admiral, the man from the Viper's pilot house, his face now a mask of burned flesh and aristocratic fury. He held a heavy naval saber in one hand and a gold-plated revolver in the other. "You've cost us millions, boy," the admiral hissed, stepping over a fallen sailor. "You've delayed the inevitable. The Mississippi is ours, whether this ship sinks or not." "Not while I'm breathing," Caleb gasped, his lungs burning. The admiral fired. The bullet grazed Caleb's ribs, spinning him around. He hit the deck, his saber skittering away. The admiral stepped forward, the gold-plated revolver aimed directly between Caleb's eyes. Blood is the only
Fog so thick it felt like breathing wet wool. The gas lamps along the pier were mere pinpricks of sickly yellow light. Caleb checked the percussion cap on his revolver, his fingers numb from the ride. Beside him, Sarah adjusted the heavy cloak she used to hide her own weapons. "The ship is the Ceres," Sarah whispered, her eyes scanning the dark hulls of the merchant vessels. "British flags, but American blood in the hold. They're loading the gold in crates marked as medical supplies. If that gold reaches the blockade runners in Wilmington, the Confederacy can buy another 2 years of gunpowder and French rifles." Caleb looked at the ledger, now tucked into his breastplate. Sterling mentioned a Leviathan. He wasn't talking about a ship. He was talking about the man running the docks. Before Sarah could respond, a low rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the wooden slats of the pier. Out of the fog emerged a figure that seemed to belong to a nightmare. He was a giant of a man, nearly 7 feet tall, wearing a leather blacksmith's apron over a formal tuxedo. In his hand, he carried a massive iron sledgehammer as if it were a walking stick. This was the Smith, the syndicate's enforcer in the north. "Move," Caleb hissed. They slipped behind a stack of cotton bales as the Smith stopped in front of the Ceres. A group of men, well-dressed gentlemen from the city's upper crust, emerged from the ship's gangplank. They were laughing, clinking glasses of sherry, while Irish laborers struggled to haul heavy iron-bound crates onto the deck. "Look at them," Sarah spat. "They toast to the Union in the daylight and line their pockets with rebel gold at night." Caleb didn't wait. He knew that if the Ceres pulled anchor, the trail would go cold. He handed Sarah his spare pistol. "Create a diversion at the stern. I'm going for the manifest and the gold." "Caleb, that giant will snap you like a dry twig," she warned. "I've survived my brother and a burning house. I'm not dying in Baltimore." As Sarah circled around the crates, Caleb moved like a shadow. He climbed the mooring ropes, his muscles screaming, and rolled onto the deck of the Ceres. The smell of expensive tobacco was stronger here. He crept toward the captain's cabin, where the manifest, the list of every trader involved in the syndicate, was kept. He found it sitting on a mahogany desk. He snatched the papers, but as he turned to leave, the door creaked open. It wasn't a guard. It was Senator Sterling's personal secretary, a man Caleb had seen in D.C. "You really are a persistent plague, Galloway," the secretary said, his voice trembling. He pulled a small derringer from his sleeve. Crack! A shot rang out, but it wasn't from the secretary's gun. Sarah had started the diversion. An explosion rocked the stern of the ship. She had found the black powder stores. In the confusion, Caleb lunged. He tackled the secretary, the two of them crashing through the cabin window and onto the main deck, the manifest scattered in the wind. "Stop him!" the secretary shrieked. The Smith turned. His eyes found Caleb. Without a word, the giant swung the sledgehammer. Caleb dove to the left, the hammer smashing the deck boards where his head had been a second before, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Caleb scrambled to his feet, drawing his saber. "You work for monsters!" The Smith smiled, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "Monsters pay better than ghosts, boy." The giant swung again. Caleb parried, but the force of the blow nearly shattered his arm. He realized he couldn't win a fight of strength. He glanced at the crane used to hoist the gold crates. It was swinging loosely in the wind, a heavy iron hook dangling just above the deck. As the Smith lunged for the final crushing blow, Caleb grabbed a loose coil of rope and looped it around the giant's ankle. "Sarah, the winch!" Caleb roared. From the shadows near the mast, Sarah pulled the release lever on the steam-powered winch. The iron hook dropped, caught the giant's leather apron, and as the counterweight fell, the giant was yanked off his feet, hoisted 10 feet into the air, dangling over the dark, freezing waters of the harbor. "The gold stays here!" Caleb yelled to the fleeing syndicate members. But the victory was short-lived. As the Irish laborers realized the ship was on fire and the law was nowhere to be found, they began to riot. The Ceres was becoming a funeral pyre. Caleb grabbed the scattered manifest papers, the list of names that would hang 100 senators, and jumped into the water just as the stern of the ship vanished in a pillar of flame. He surfaced, gasping for air, clutching the wet papers. Sarah pulled him onto a rowboat, her face pale. "We got it," Caleb coughed, holding up the damp list. "Every name, every bank. The chains are finally showing their cracks." "It's not enough," Sarah said, pointing toward the horizon. "Look." Through the clearing fog, they saw 3 more ships, identical to the Ceres, slipping out of a different pier, heading for the open sea. The syndicate wasn't a single ship, it was an armada. Caleb looked at the names in his hand. The war was no longer just about the North and the South. It was a war against a global empire of greed. "Then we follow them," Caleb said, his eyes turning to flint. "To the end of the world if we have to."
The salt spray stung Caleb's eyes as the Wanderer, a captured blockade runner turned privateer, sliced through the choppy waters off the coast of the Carolinas. Gone was the blue wool of the infantry. Caleb now wore a rugged, salt-stained duster and a wide-brimmed hat, his skin bronzed by a month at sea. He stood at the bow, looking through a brass spyglass. Behind him, the crew, a mix of Union sailors, freedmen from the Baltimore docks, and hardened mercenaries, moved with the quiet efficiency of men who knew they were technically outlaws. To the Union, they were a special mission. To the syndicate, they were the plague. The Ceres was the tail of the beast, Sarah said, stepping up beside him. She had taken to the sea better than Caleb, her eyes always fixed on the horizon. Our contact in Bermuda says the other 3 ships met a fourth, a massive ironclad called the Ouroboros. It's a British-built monster, funded by the bankers we're hunting. Where is it heading? Caleb asked, his voice rasping from the sea air. The Bahamas, Nassau, she replied. The syndicate is using the neutral port to consolidate the gold. They're not just buying guns anymore, Caleb. They're buying a private army to seize the Mississippi. If they control the river, they split the Union in 3. The war ends on their terms. Suddenly, the lookout shrieked from the crow's nest. "Sails on the leeward! Black smoke!" Caleb swung his glass. In the distance, a thick plume of coal smoke choked the pristine blue sky. It wasn't a merchant ship. It was a warship, low in the water, her hull armored with interlocking plates of cold-rolled steel. "That's one of them," Caleb whispered. "The Viper. It's a scout for the ironclad." "We can't outgun her," the captain of the Wanderer shouted, his hand on the wheel. "That iron skin will bounce our 12-pounders like pebbles." "We don't need to outgun her," Caleb said, the tactical mind he'd sharpened in the trenches of Tennessee clicking into gear. "Captain, bring us into the wind. Sarah, get the special shipment we took from the Baltimore warehouse." The Viper began to turn, her massive swivel gun on the foredeck rotating toward them. A flash of fire erupted from her bow, and a 100-pound shell whistled over our masts, crashing into the ocean with a roar that shook the Wanderer to its keel. "Closer!" Caleb yelled. The Wanderer veered dangerously close to the ironclad, dancing on the edge of the Viper's range. As they pulled alongside, Sarah and 3 men hauled up crates filled with glass jars. These weren't filled with gunpowder. They were filled with a volatile mixture of phosphorus and whale oil they'd stolen from the syndicate's own labs. "Fire!" The crew launched the jars using hand slings. They shattered against the Iron Viper's hull, and the moment the phosphorus hit the air, it erupted into a blinding, white-hot chemical fire. The iron didn't melt, but the heat became unbearable for the men inside. More importantly, the thick, acrid smoke was sucked into the Viper's air intake vents. The ironclad began to veer wildly as its crew gasped for air. "Now!" Caleb commanded. He grabbed a grappling hook and swung, his duster billowing behind him. He landed on the scorching deck of the Viper, just as Sarah and the boarders followed. The deck was a chaos of white smoke and screaming men. Caleb fought through the haze, his saber clashing against the cutlasses of syndicate mercenaries. He reached the armored pilot's house and kicked the door open. Inside, he found a man he'd recognized from the Galloway Ledger, a former Union admiral who had retired months ago. "The location," Caleb growled, pressing his pistol to the admiral's temple. "You're too late, boy. The chains are already around the throat of your republic. The Ouroboros isn't in Nassau. She's already entered the mouth of the Mississippi. By tomorrow, New Orleans will be under a new flag, not the stars and bars, the gold and black." Caleb's heart sank. They had been lured out to sea while the real threat moved toward the heart of the country. "Sarah!" Caleb yelled, running to the railing as the Viper began to list. "Signal the crew. We're not going to Nassau. We have to race the devil to New Orleans." The Viper exploded behind them as they retreated to the Wanderer. The ocean was a graveyard of fire, but the real battle was moving back to the dirt and the river. Caleb looked at the map. To reach New Orleans in time, they would have to sail through the heart of a hurricane brewing in the Gulf. "We won't survive a storm like that," the captain warned. "Then we die trying," Caleb said, staring at the darkening sky. because if we don't stop that ironclad, there won't be a nation left to bury us.
Through a dying world, under the cover of darkness and a forged set of Confederate intelligence papers, Caleb and Sarah crossed the lines into the heart of the rebellion. Richmond was a city of contrasts, grand marble columns standing next to soup kitchens and high society galas held while the distant rumble of Union siege guns shook the chandeliers. The air here didn't smell of salt or gunpowder. It smelled of desperation and expensive perfume. According to the Admiral's confession, the head of the snake isn't a politician, Sarah whispered as they walked through the Capitol Square, their breaths frosting in the biting winter air. It's a woman named Lady Evelyn Thorne. She's the one who laundered the syndicate's gold through the Richmond banks. She's hosting a masked ball tonight at the White House of the Confederacy. Caleb adjusted the stiff collar of his stolen Confederate major's uniform. His ribs still ached from the battle on the Wanderer, and his hands felt empty without the weight of his rifle. A masked ball. How fitting. The people destroying this country are afraid to show their faces. They reached a safe house in the shadows of the Church Hill district, a basement belonging to a network of enslaved people and Union sympathizers known as the Great Dismal Path. Inside, by the light of a single candle, Caleb laid out the final pages of the ledger. "Lady Thorne has a safe," a voice came from the corner. It was a young man named Micah, a house servant for the Thornes who had been feeding information to the resistance for years. "It's behind the portrait of her late husband. It doesn't hold gold, Major. It holds the original covenant." "The covenant?" Caleb asked. "A document signed by men in both the North and the South," Micah explained, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. "It's a literal contract to extend the war by another 5 years. They've agreed to a stalemate, a managed conflict, to ensure the price of cotton and weapons stays at a premium. They're killing thousands for a profit margin." Caleb felt a cold fury settle into his marrow. It wasn't just treason, it was a ritual sacrifice of an entire generation. That night, the Thorne estate was a beacon of light in a city cloaked in shadow. Carriages lined the cobblestones, and the sound of violins drifted through the iron gates. Caleb entered through the front door, his forged papers passing the scrutiny of the guards, while Sarah slipped through the servants' entrance, dressed in the uniform of a caterer. The ballroom was a sea of velvet and silk. Men in gray and gold danced with women in massive hoop skirts, their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain and feathers. Caleb moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning for the portrait Micah had described. He found it in a private study adjacent to the ballroom. Lady Evelyn Thorne stood beneath it, holding a glass of champagne. She was elegant, her hair a silver blonde coil, but her eyes were as sharp and predatory as a hawk's. She was speaking to a man in a civilian suit, a man Caleb recognized from the Bank Street house in D.C. The conspiracy was sitting in the same room, sipping wine while the boys in the trenches froze to death. "Major," Lady Thorne said, her voice like silk over gravel as Caleb approached. 24th Kentucky, ma'am," Caleb said, bowing slightly. "We've been in the mud so long I forgot what a floor looked like." She laughed, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. "The 24th. I heard they were wiped out at the Red River. A tragedy." "Some of us are harder to kill than others," Caleb replied, his hand resting near the concealed dagger at his waist. Just then, a commotion broke out in the hall. A tray of crystal glasses shattered. Sarah had provided the distraction. As Lady Thorne and her guest stepped toward the door to investigate, Caleb slipped behind the portrait. He felt for the hidden latch. Click! The wall swung open to reveal a heavy steel safe. He didn't have the combination, but he didn't need it. He had brought a small charge of the Smith's phosphorus mixture. He smeared the gel onto the hinges and ignited it with a friction match. The heat was intense, silent, and fast. The steel softened like wax.
He pulled the door open. Inside lay a single vellum-bound folder. He opened it and felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a map of the Union's upcoming spring offensive, signed by 3 Union generals and 4 Confederate ministers. It was the blueprint for a slaughter. "Put it back, Caleb," the voice came from the doorway. Caleb spun around, his hand flying to his pistol. Standing there, bathed in the flickering light of the fireplace, was a man he thought he'd seen die in the flames of the Galloway estate. His face was a map of burn scars, and his left arm was missing, but the eyes were unmistakable. "Julian," Caleb whispered. "I told you, brother, blood is the only thing that's real, and right now, yours is the only thing standing in the way of a very profitable peace." The violins in the ballroom hit a high, soaring note, masking the sound of Julian cocking the hammer. The House of Chains was no longer a metaphor. It was a room with 2 brothers, a stolen contract, and a gun that was about to go off. Julian stood in the doorway, his silhouette twisted and jagged. The firelight played across his scars, making them dance like snakes. The Lamette revolver in his hand was steady, a heavy 9-shot beast that didn't care about brotherhood. "How?" Caleb breathed, his hand frozen inches from the vellum folder. "I saw the floor collapse. I saw you go down into the furnace." "The tunnels, Caleb," Julian rasped, his voice a dry wheeze. "The same tunnels our assets dug to hide the gold. I fell into a pit of coal dust and shadows. The syndicate found me. They put me back together with clockwork and spite. They made me a ghost so I could hunt the man who tried to kill his own blood." "I didn't try to kill you, Julian. I tried to save you from yourself," Caleb's voice cracked. "Look at this covenant. They're planning to throw 10,000 men into a meat grinder at the Rapidan River next month, not to win the war, but to keep the stock prices high in London. They're killing thousands for a profit margin." "I'm protecting the only world that's left," Julian roared, taking a step forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. "You think the Union is pure? You think the North cares about the slaves? They care about the factories. They care about the rail lines. This covenant is the only thing keeping the world from total chaos. It's a managed fire. If you put it out, the whole forest burns." "Then let it burn," Caleb lunged. He didn't go for his gun. He grabbed the heavy brass inkwell from the desk and hurled it at Julian's head. Julian fired, the roar of the Lamette deafening in the small room. The bullet shattered a bust of Jefferson Davis behind Caleb, showering him in white marble dust. Caleb tackled Julian, the 2 of them crashing into the desk.
Silent panic. The news of the Richmond fire had reached the capital, and the air was thick with the scent of paranoia. Soldiers patrolled every corner, but they weren't looking for rebels. They were looking for him. "The vice president is at the old Capitol prison," Sarah whispered as they crouched in the shadows of an alleyway near Pennsylvania Avenue. "Not as a prisoner, but as a visitor. They've moved the gold-black leadership there for a secret tribunal. They're going to execute the lower-level spies to bury the evidence before the covenant can be leaked." "And my father?" Caleb's voice was a jagged edge. "He's with them. He's the one holding the gavel." Caleb looked at the massive stone walls of the prison. It was a fortress of despair, a place where the Union's enemies were kept in the dark. Now it was the final sanctuary for the men who had betrayed the Union from within. "We can't storm the front," Caleb said, checking the cylinders of his 2 revolvers. "But the prison was built over the old sewer lines. If the syndicate used tunnels in Richmond, they're using them here." They entered the bowels of the city, wading through knee-deep water and filth. The map in the Covenant folder was precise. It showed a forgotten service entrance leading directly into the warden's private chambers. As they climbed the iron rungs of a hidden ladder, the muffled sound of voices drifted down.
Caleb signaled Sarah to stay low. He pushed the trapdoor open and stepped into a room draped in heavy velvet and smelling of expensive brandy. Through the heavy oak doors of the adjoining chamber, a voice boomed, a voice Caleb had heard every morning of his childhood. "The sacrifice is necessary for the preservation of the order," Thomas Galloway said. Caleb kicked the doors open. The room was a theater of the elite. 6 men sat around a circular table. At the center sat Vice President Andrew Johnson's chief of staff and 3 Union generals. At the head of the table sat Thomas Galloway, looking immaculate in a black frock coat, his silver hair catching the light of the gas lamps. "Order?" Caleb's voice rang out like a gunshot. "Is that what you call a managed slaughter, Father?" The men scrambled, but Caleb and Sarah already had their barrels leveled. The guards in the room, realizing they were outmatched by the 2 ghosts who had survived the hurricane and the fire, froze. Thomas Galloway didn't flinch. He slowly stood up, looking at his son with a mixture of pity and cold calculation. "Caleb, you were always too stubborn to see the grand design. You think a nation can survive on ideals? A nation survives on balance. We gave the North their industry and the South their pride. We just made sure the costs were distributed." "Distributed in graves," Caleb roared. He threw the covenant folder onto the table. "I have the signatures, I have the maps. The 24th Kentucky didn't die for a grand design. They died for your bank accounts." "Do you think the people will care?" Thomas asked, stepping toward his son. "If you release that, the Union Army will desert. The South will surge. You'll be the man who ended America, not the man who saved it. Is your truth worth 1,000,000 more dead?" Caleb looked at the document. He looked at his father, the man who had taught him about honor while signing the death warrants of his friends. "The Union isn't a flag, Father," Caleb said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's a promise, and you broke it." Suddenly, the Vice President's chief of staff lunged for a hidden bell cord to alert the garrison. Bang! Sarah fired, the bullet severing the cord. The room exploded into chaos. The gold blacks drew concealed pistols. Caleb dived behind the heavy mahogany table as lead ripped through the air, shattering the brandy decanters and the ornate mirrors. In the crossfire, Thomas Galloway didn't run. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small derringer, aiming it not at Caleb, but at the covenant folder. He wanted the evidence destroyed. "No!" Caleb lunged across the table. He tackled his father just as the derringer fired. The bullet scorched the edge of the vellum, but the folder remained intact. They crashed to the floor. Caleb looked into his father's eyes and saw nothing but the cold vacuum of greed. "You're not my father," Caleb whispered. "You're just another chain." Outside, the sound of boots thundered in the hallway. The prison guards were coming. "Take the folder and go," Caleb yelled to Sarah. "Get it to the newspaper offices. Get it to the streets." "Caleb, I'm not leaving you." "Go. If this stays in this room, we all die for nothing." Sarah snatched the folder, her eyes wet with tears. She disappeared back through the trap door, just as the main doors burst open. A dozen soldiers flooded the room. Caleb stood up, his hands raised, standing over the cowering leaders of the syndicate. He looked at his father, the man who was being hauled up by the guards. "It's over, Thomas," Caleb said. The epilogue, the new dawn. The headline the next morning didn't speak of a battle, it spoke of a betrayal. The Washington Star printed every signature, every map, and every dollar amount from the covenant. The nation didn't shatter, it erupted in a different kind of fire, a fire of accountability. The generals were stripped of their stars, the vice president's staff was dismantled, and Thomas Galloway was led to the gallows in the very prison where he had tried to bury the truth. Caleb Galloway stood on the docks of the Potomac, watching the sun rise. He wore a simple civilian coat. His guns were gone. He looked at the scars on his hands and the weight in his heart. The war would continue for a few more months, but the managed conflict was over. The soldiers in the trenches now knew who the real enemies were. The chains weren't all broken. They never truly are. But for the first time in history, the people knew exactly how they were forged. Sarah walked up beside him, leaning against the railing. "What now, Hunter?" Caleb looked toward the west, toward the hills of Kentucky that were no longer his home, and then toward the future that was finally unwritten. "Now," Caleb said, a small, tired smile touching his lips, "we build something that doesn't need chains to hold it together."
Water in a shallow-bottomed skiff. Moses stood at the stern, navigating with a long pole, his movements silent and rhythmic. Caleb sat at the bow, his rifle resting across his knees, watching the glowing eyes of alligators retreat into the reeds. "The Blackwood plantation shouldn't exist," Moses whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of cicadas. "It was burned out in the 50s after a slave revolt. The bayou reclaimed it, but the vipers, they like the rot. It keeps the law away." Suddenly, a faint rhythmic thumping echoed through the trees. It wasn't a heartbeat, it was a steam-powered press. "The forgers," Caleb said. "They're already printing." They rounded a bend, and the trees opened up to reveal a nightmare of architecture. The Blackwood Manor was a crumbling ruin, its white paint peeled away like dead skin, held upright by massive iron braces and wooden scaffolding. Torches burned in iron braziers along the porch, and men in dark duster coats, the ghost vipers, patrolled the perimeter with repeating rifles. But it was the center of the clearing that stopped Caleb's heart. Sarah was there. She wasn't in a cell. She was standing on the porch next to the chemist, her face pale, but her expression unreadable. She wore a dress of dark silk, and around her neck was a heavy gold locket, the same one Caleb had seen in the syndicate's archives. "She's not a prisoner, Caleb," Moses muttered, his hand tightening on his pole. "Look at how the guards move around her. They aren't watching her. They're obeying her." The realization hit Caleb harder than a physical blow.